There's not even a title, right?
And are you looking for slides?
No, I don't have any slides. So
No slides.
yeah.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. I'm like an impromptu speaker. I was just called in because someone was missing from the program. I'm just a fill-in, so don't expect too much. But yeah, my name is Adam, and I'm going to talk about. I think the title of the talk is like the commons in the Anthropocene. Yeah?
Risking together.
Risking together, the commons in the
yeah,
okay.
Yes.
So it's a bit of an abstract title, but that's because I'm sort of an abstract guy. I don't do anything practically. I'm a professor of sociology, and Michel Bauwens asked me to talk about my new book. So it's going to be a little bit different, but still maybe it'll be a little bit of context, because one of the things the problems that I've sort of been posing to myself for a lot of time, both researching and teaching, etc., is that there seems to be a certain impasse around, right? That we have a certain model of the digital and digital technologies that theoretically has a lot of potential, right? And we've seen a lot of ideas and a lot of technical initiatives and a lot of innovation going on, but the way in which it's being used unfortunately seems to be part of the problem rather than the solution, right? So how can you get out of this? How can you sort of think about building a different type of digital, right? Because there's no doubt about the fact that digital technologies, blockchains, artificial intelligence, like a lot of the very, very interesting examples that we've seen this morning, as they've shown, right, is that whatever type of effort that we make to confront the situation of the Anthropocene will require these types of technologies, right? But yet, it seems that most of the investments in digital innovation right now is going into prolonging a consumer society that was from the last century, which is sort of, everybody knows it's unsustainable and unreliable, right? So in this book, I was trying to think a little bit about what are the challenges around this, right? And the challenges, I think, are mainly political, because there's no doubt that there's no lack of ideas, right? Ideas are cheap, they used to say even in startups like 10 years ago, but there's a lot of brilliant ideas around, right? Whether these are technological ideas or whether these are ways of implementing organizational forms that are developed in very complex corporate organizations and putting them to use for the common good, etc., right? But the problem is, what we lack, I think, is a reliable social force that can implement these ideas, right? Because technology and ideas never ever change anything on their own, right? We tend to put a lot of faith perhaps in technology, but historically, the way in which technologies are being implemented and the way in which, the direction in which they drive change is heavily dependent on the surrounding political climate, right? So if you take AI, for example, AI has an enormous potential, of course, to do all these sorts of things that we've been talking about today, to make forests speak for themselves, or to localize environmental destruction via satellite imagery, etc., etc. But the ways in which things are going right now, it seems more likely that AI is going to be put into the service of the 1 or perhaps 0.1% of the elites that are actually now controlling the investments, right? So the thing is, the question of politics, right? And what do you need? What do you need for a politics? Well, you need, of course, ideas and you need visions, but most of all, you need a coalition of actors, right? You need something that you call a social bloc, right? I mean, if you think about the present Silicon Valley model of the digital, it's not something that has simply been derived from these features of technology, right? It's a way of which to use a combination of certain established technologies, smartphones, mobile connectivity, database systems, targeting algorithms, etc., that have been favored by a particular configuration of actors, right? Financial capital, which is looking for investments, the California tech industry, state apparatuses all around the world, not least at the local level. City governments are seeking urban development, think it's a good idea to invest in startups and incubators and these sorts of things. But then not least the global middle classes, who in the last 20 years have seen significant upgrades in their capacity to consume, right? And now you don't have to call the pizzeria, you can just press a button and the pizza arrives. So that's like a significant upgrade, right? So you've got this coalition of actors who are supporting a particular model, right? And I think what we need to think about if we want to achieve some sort of technologically empowered change is also to think about what is the coalition of actors that we can find that can be supporting this type of different paradigm, right? And in order to think about that, what I wanted to do in this book is, of course, not to suggest any solutions, because if I had any solutions, I would be rich, right? Or I would be off consulting to the really important players in a sense. But unfortunately, just try to sort out the terrain, right? I mean, to identify a little bit the challenges that needs to be faced in order to build such a kind of social bloc, right? And in doing so, I'm departing from this idea of the Anthropocene, right? Which I think is like one of the best concepts around to give a coherent diagnosis of what our time is about, right? And I think you're all familiar probably with this concept, right? The Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is, well, it's a concept that comes from geology. And in geology, it means that we are generating a new strata in the sediments of planetary history, right? We are generating a new strata which is different from the strata of the Holocene that preceded us. Holocene is about the last 10,000 years until the last ice age, more or less. And we're generating a new strata where future geologists are going to find a very particular composition, right? They're going to find a particular composition which consists in lots of fossilized plastics, not historically unprecedented, but very high CO2 levels, radioactive isotopes that didn't exist before, and an enormous quantity of chicken bones, right? Because apparently our agro-industrial complex produces chicken in geologically significant quantities, right? So this means, of course, that we have now become a terraforming species, right? We have become the largest force of planetary transformation. And this is quite important in terms of its implications from a philosophical and a political. 10 minutes or 10 seconds? Okay, that's fine. From political or philosophical implication, because it means that we can't really understand each other ourselves anymore as being small insignificant beings in God's great universe, but we have to understand that we have become something close to God-like ourselves, right? And then the question then is that the main challenge then, of course, is how do you conduct such terraforming activity in anything that resembles a responsible and sustainable manner, right? And I don't think we really have we might have the ideas for how to do that, but we definitely do not have the organizational forms that allows us to do that right yet, right? So that is a major challenge, right? When people talk about the Anthropocene, there are other people that says that, well, we shouldn't call it the Anthropocene because it's capitalism, right? So, and we should call it the Capitalocene, right? And that's true, because if you look at the historical records, all of the curves that are indicating this new type of terraforming activity that we are exercising on Earth, whether it's CO2 emissions or water consumption or urbanization or travel or economic growth, all these sorts of things, all of these curves have the same form. They are like basically static, like this, up until the mid-18th century. Then they start to grow, and then in the late 20th century, they have like the hockey stick phase, right? They become exponential. So that means, of course, that the Anthropocene coincides historically with the emergence and globalization of industrial capitalism, right? Plastics in the 1950s is the great substance of consumer society. We couldn't imagine the type of consumption we have today without plastics, right? So, so this thing, of course, this is because of a whole series of factors, but Marx, who was the greatest analyst of capitalism in the last century, when he used to think about labor and the exploitation of labor. But before he died, he started reading lot of things from the new discipline of organic chemistry, and he came up with this idea of a metabolic rift. So he essentially, Marx says that what capitalism really does, it doesn't just exploit workers and things like that. It creates a situation where energy and nutrients are taken from the land, but not brought back to the land, right? Pre-capitalist communities, societies tend to have a circular relation to nature, right? You eat things, you poop, the poop sort of goes back and nurtures the land. No? But Marx noted that in the mid-19th century England, well, we get all this grain from the land, and in fact we're now importing guano from South America to fertilize the land because we're consuming the natural nutrients, and then we bring the grain to London, and then people eat it, and then they poop in the Thames, and the poop becomes not a resource but a problem, right? So you get this sort of cradle to grave system in a sense, right? And that's essentially inherently what capitalism does. Capitalism has created this situation of sort of planless terraforming, not because of greed or because people are evil or anything like that, but because one of the systematic feature of capitalism is to systematically externalize the costs of reproduction, to sort of consume things that you don't pay back for, right? So you create cheap things by basically creating negative externalities, by not paying for the actual costs that are being used. And so from this perspective, of course, the Anthropocene can be understood as a crisis of reproduction, right? An inability to reproduce the conditions for future existence. And it's a crisis of reproduction that is articulated at different levels. On the material level, of course, which we all know, resource depletion, and we don't have to talk about that so much more, but also at the symbolic level, right? And because we now have a capitalist system which is running out of steam, right? Because it's going into the limits. You can also say that the experience of the Anthropocene is the experience of what you can say the end of cheap nature, right? This type of simply sort of plundering and extracting resources, which we have been doing for over 100 years, has now reached a position where it's not so simple anymore, right? So there's less resources to plunder for each unit of capital, so to say, right? And this means that capitalism tends to start to self-cannibalize, in a sense. It starts to try to make money from the crisis that it's generated itself. Right? You can see that very much if you look at what I call the crisis of symbolic reproduction, in the sense that it's becoming increasingly difficult for us to come up with a common idea of a future, or even, as I think COVID showed to a lot of us, a common truth, right? A common definition of the situation. We're in a situation now where we have a multitude of different thought communities that each are arguing for their own truth, right? Are vaccines good? Are they bad? Is climate change right? Is climate change wrong? And all these sorts of things, right? And that is, of course, to a large extent, it has to do, of course, with the fragmentation of communities, which in itself is also a consequence of the general speeding up of life, particularly in the last decades. But it also has a lot to do with the way in which social media business models operate, right? They operate by tending to produce easily marketable advertising targets, which tends to polarize, right? So that's a situation whereby things like social media make money by sort of trying to address the crisis of things like truth or a common ground, but in ways that tends to sort of worsen the situation, right? And then, of course, we have a fundamental crisis of social reproduction, in the sense that not only is this the Anthropocene paralyzed by a situation whereby we have increasing amounts of loneliness in the world. I think about 40% of North American males, middle-aged North American males, claim that they don't have a single friend. Right? Children come to school in the UK without having been properly socialized without knowing how to speak, without knowing how to control their poop, etc., because the situation of mothers, and particularly single mothers, is not such that you have the sort of network and framework enough to raise a child, right? And we have growing problems with depression and anxiety and all these sorts of things, right? So in that sense, I think any type of sort of effort to create some sort of coherence around a particular model or a different model of the digital that is sort of able to achieve what we want needs to work also on these levels, right? There needs to be something that is not simply able to offer alternative ecological or economic functions, but also able to offer different answers to this crisis, both of the imagination, right? How do we imagine a different world together? How do we come together around what we understand to be a truth, right? But also the question of social reproduction, right? Which in a certain sense boils down to the question of risk, right? How do we find new ways of risking together, of sharing this type of exposure to uncertainty, which sort of social institutions have always achieved throughout history, right? Finding ways in which people can face uncertainty together in ways that are risky, that is, in ways that are calculable and able to be handled in different ways. And now I have 1 minute left, and but the last thing I wanted to say is that someone said before that we have to fix the plane as we're flying, right? And I'm a strong believer in that paradigm. I don't think there are any solutions that we can come up with right now, because the paradigm shift that we are facing is so great that we simply have no idea about what these solutions would look like. These are probably things that, as has happened throughout most other similar times in history, these types of solutions and remedies will be something that we developed as we go through a crisis, which in all likelihood would be probably quite severe and probably is going to be enacted within our lifetimes. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much.